Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Jews have a historical right to the land of Palestine. That's a common claim that have been advertised by those who support the illegal occupation of Palestine, especially among the politicians, media, and their general public. Now, let's examine that claim historically to see whether it holds any weight. And to do so, I'm going to use the scriptures of the Jews themselves, as well as historical academic references from non-Muslims. So, going back in history to see how this all began, God commands Abraham, who was born in what we call today Iraq, to travel to Canaan, which was the lands of the Canaanites. And as we see here, long before the children of Israel even existed, this land belonged to the Canaanites, as far as we can trace back ownership in history. So Abraham travels there at approximately 2000 BC, and God promises to give him and to his descendants that land as mentioned in the Old Testament in Genesis chapter 12. And then he gets married and he have children, including Ishmael and Isaac. And then Ishmael has a son, which is Jacob, and God promises both Isaac and Jacob that land. The reason I'm emphasizing this promise is because we will come back to it later on, as it's very important. Then God names Jacob Israel, and that's how the name comes into existence. Then Jacob begets 12 sons, and the famous story between Joseph and his brothers takes place, and Joseph becomes a person of authority in Egypt. Soon after, a drought takes place in Palestine, so the children of Jacob go to Egypt to seek help. Then they find Joseph, who tells them to bring Jacob and all the Israelites and move to Egypt for a better life and to escape the drought that was happening in Palestine. Till here we see that Abraham was a stranger in the land of Palestine, and all his descendants, including Isaac and Jacob, were also strangers in this land of the native people of the Canaanites. And they eventually decide to leave because of the circumstances in Palestine. Later on, Jacob and Joseph die, and his descendants remain in Egypt happily until Pharaoh starts killing and enslaving the Israelites. And there God sends them Moses, who, as the story goes, take them out from Egypt at approximately 1446 BC and makes his way back to Palestine, again the land of the Canaanites. And on his way, on what is known today as Mount Sinai, we see the beginning of what is known today as the Jewish religion, as Moses received tablets and commandments from God. But the Jews, they disobey Moses and they disobey the commandments of God, and they start worshipping the calf. Therefore, God punishes them and ordains that they will be lost in the land for 40 years, so that corrupt generation dies and a new generation replaces it. And God tells them that he will give them the land of the Canaanites once more, which was called Palestine, as documented from empires like the Babylonians and the Romans and the Assyrians. So Moses makes his way to the land, but never steps foot in the land, and he dies. So Joshua takes command after the death of Moses, and he starts to invade the land of the Canaanites. And the Israelites start wiping out as much as they could from the native people who were living in the land of Canaan, killing both men, women, and children, animals, and even burning their lands, as we can see in the Old Testament in Joshua chapter 6, chapter 8, and chapter 10. So don't be surprised today when you see the occupation forces in Palestine killing innocent women and children, because that's what's mentioned in their books, and that's what they believe, and that's what they did in the past. After that, Joshua gets old, so God commands him to divide the land amongst his 12 tribes, and at approximately 1356 BC, including the lands that they have not yet occupied or were able to take by force. So each tribe can fight for the part of the land that is promised for them. And then God commands them to slaughter everyone who lives in the promised land, and everyone who lives far from the promised land, they can slaughter the men and take the women and the bounties of the land for them, as mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 20. Then God also promises them that he will kick the people out of that land, and he will deliver the kings of that land to their hands, so they can kill them and remove their names from history, in order for them to fabricate history as if these nations and these kings never existed. And no, I'm not making this up. This is actually what the Old Testament says. Then Judah fights and takes over Urushalim, as was named by the Canaanites, and the rest of the sons and the tribes of Jacob fight for their alleged promised parts of the land, but they were weaker than Judah, so they couldn't kill the natives that live in these other parts of the land like Judah did, and they end up forcing tribute on them. Yes, tribute, jizya, that they always complain about when they talk to Muslims. Anyways, as Judges chapter 1 mentions, they had to keep the natives in the land eventually. They couldn't kick them out. And after that, we have the first actual occupation of the land of Palestine at the hands of King Saul, who unites the 12 tribes and makes a kingdom for them at approximately 1051 BC. Then after him, King David comes and King Solomon as well, and he builds the temple for them. But then after the death of King Solomon, the corruption spreads in the land by the Israelites and disbelief starts. At that time, the land was divided into two parts, the Empire of Judah and the Empire of Israel. And the Assyrians invade the land. They took over the whole empire of Israel as well as Egypt. Then the Assyrian Empire started exiling the Jews from the land to what we call today Iraq. After that, and at approximately 612 BC, the Babylonian Empire took the land, and they also took the Empire of Judah, which was the part of the land that was left. And they destroyed the Temple of Solomon and exiled the remaining Israelites to Iraq, which is known as the Babylonian exile at 586 BC. And here we see that throughout the whole history of the Israelites, they only ruled that land that they claim is their land for approximately 420 years, and they took over that land through genocide of as much as they could of the natives and the people who were living there, and forcing tribute on the rest that they couldn't massacre like the other people. Then the Babylonian Empire didn't last long, as the Persians took over at 536 BC, and a small number of the Israelites who were exiled to Iraq went back to Palestine, around 50,000 people as the Old Testament record shows, as the majority of them already died in wars and during their exile. So that small number of Israelites who came back lived as subject in the land alongside the rest of the native tribes who were still there under subjugation of the Persian rule. After that, the Persians lost the land to Alexander the Great, and after the death of Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire took over the land, and the Israelites revolted against Titus, the Roman Empire, and he defeated them and destroyed their temple. And afterwards, they also revolted against Hadrian, the Roman Emperor, who defeated them, killed them, and kicked them out of the land at approximately 132 BC. And from that date onwards, the Jews had no presence in the land of Palestine until the Muslims fought them and took the land from them at approximately 336 AD by Umar ibn Khattab, the second Caliphate of Islam, and it stayed under the Muslims until 1917 AD. It didn't get out of the position of the Muslims except at 1099 AD, where it fell under the hand of the Crusade, 80 years until Salahuddin took the land back from them. So if anyone has the right to the land because of previous rulership, it would be the Muslims who ruled the land for approximately 1,300 years, in contrast to the Israelites who only ruled for around 420 years. And if anyone has the right to the land from a historical point of view, it would be the Canaanites, who were a group of people who came from the land of Arabia 6,000 years ago, before any Jewish person ever existed, and settled in the land. And many of their descendants became Muslims during Muslim rule, and Palestinians today are from the descendants of the Canaanites, as the historical record shows. Ilian Beatty says in her book, Arabs and Jews in the Land of Canaan, the Arab invaders of the land of Canaan during 700 AD made Muslim converts of the natives, settled down as residents, and intermarried with them, with the result that they are now completely Arabized, and we cannot tell where the Canaanites leave off and the Arabs begin. So whether it's a historical right because of ruralship or because of historical presence in Palestine, Palestinians have right to that land. And in the end of the 19th century, the Zionist political movement comes to surface through the lead of people like the Austrian journalist Herzl, and his movement aims to achieve three goals. The first is calling the Jews to return to the land of Palestine, rebuilding the Temple of Solomon, and establishing the State of Israel. So the first thing that movement did is to organize immigration movements of Jewish population from Europe to the land of Palestine. And the number of Jews who lived in Palestine at 1882 AD did not exceed 3% of the overall population. So from 1882 AD until 1948 AD, they organized 6 immigration movements, moving the Jewish people from a 3% population in the land of Palestine to 31% of the population, in which the land was under British rule, who gave majority of the land to the Jews and forcefully gave them recognition of a colonial terrorist state. That's why we see that majority of their government officials are originally immigrants coming from Europe. So there is no doubt that Zionists have no claim to the land of Palestine, whether that be politically, religiously, or historically, and they are a group of terrorists occupying a land that isn't theirs by force. And that will remain a historical fact, no matter how hard their media tries to change it. And if you are a supporter of their terrorist state killing children, women, and innocent civilians, just because their book tells them so, then in reality you are supporting every terrorist group that ever existed in history. Why? Because they make the exact same claim. The Crusades made that claim. ISIS makes that claim, that they're killing these people because their book tells them so. So if you're supporting the Zionists, you might as well support these other people. And you shouldn't have any issue if someone one day knocks on your door holding a grenade and telling you to leave the house just because his book tells him that you should leave the house. And you should happily give him your house and move and all your family outside, since you believe in that. Now, the truth will remain that they are an occupying colonial terrorist so-called state, and they have no right to that land, indigenous or otherwise.